So anyway, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll sort of stop myself as we go just to check if there are other people that need to be admitted. But it's great to see you all. I think that you are all Grub Street students, or people that I know from Grub Street. So it's great to see familiar faces. It's been a while. This is I'm still working for Grub Street. I'm still teaching for Grub Street, but this is a new thing that I like the idea of the format of it. And I like the fact that the courses can be recorded, but it's also nice that it's sort of shorter. So I like that. So hopefully this will be something that you'll get something out of. And this is actually my first time teaching for the Skills, but it's a really cool sort of startup company. I've been really enjoying kind of getting to know them. But anyway, I hope all of your writing is going well. I'm not going to do formal introductions today because this is going to be something that's recording, and I want to make sure that the people who are just looking at the recording, feel like they're getting right into the meat of the matter. And also, oh, here's David. Okay, there's also a lot to cover today, so that's another reason to dispense with introductions. But I'm assuming, and we actually can talk as we go along. I'm assuming that all of you are in some way writers, but classes also, could be good for people who are wanting to get back into writing or are writing for other reasons, etc. There's another familiar face. Hello. How are you? You're muted. So anyway, it's great to see you all. So as I was saying, I'm just going to jump in because this is being recorded and we do have a lot to cover. Do feel free though to interrupt at any time. You can either raise your hand or you can put something in the chat, or you can just jump in. If I'm ignoring you, that's totally fine. We're a small enough group that we can have conversations. And actually, if you have questions or whatever, or comments or thoughts, it might help other people who are watching this. So this is part one of a 3-part series on sentence level music. And the classes also are sort of designed to stand alone. So don't feel badly if you can't make it to all 3. But again, you can listen to the recordings, which if you've signed up for this course, should be available to you indefinitely on Vimeo, and links will be sent to you sometime next week. So welcome. I just want to start off with a story, not really a story, but sort of, a little backstory on me. I'm a writer, as many of you know. I'm a novelist and a short story writer, and I teach in an MFA program called the Newport MFA, and also at Grub Street in Boston. And I love teaching because it helps me become a better writer. And I think that's particularly true with working on the sentence level. So when I was younger, I used to be a ski instructor. And when I was a ski instructor, the Professional Ski Instructors of America used to offer a clinic every week. And it was sort of mandatory clinic. You go out on the snow and they would break down, the whole idea was to break down your ski turn into its component parts. So they use terms like center line, edging versus sliding, etc. And I was young at the time. I was just out of college, and I was sort of a rebel at that point. And I really resisted this idea of breaking down the way that I ski. I had been skiing all my life. I know how to turn. Why should I think about it? And so I was kind of, rebellious and just ignored it. This is ridiculous. It's a waste of time. But in the end, breaking it down like that, even something as intuitive as a ski turn, made me a better skier. And I think that is why oh, I think I have to let somebody in. Hold on one sec. No, I'm good. Okay. And that is why we analyze our craft as writers, because it makes us better. And it makes us better not only as editors when we're revising our work. Some of you who have taken classes with me know that I'm really big on revision. I think revision is 99% of writing. But it also makes us a better first draft writers in kind of mysterious way, looking at these things analytically, analyzing the craft. And I think this seems especially true at the sentence level, because the sentence is the equivalent of the turn in skiing. It's something that we use intuitively. All of us use sentences in our daily life. And so we figure we know them pretty well. And it's true, we do know them pretty well. But if we break them down and look at them it can make us better first draft writers. So because the sentence is the equivalent of the turn and skiing, sentences are the basic unit of action in writing. Another way to put it is language is the paint, sentences are the brushstrokes. The best painters are the ones who become so fluent with their brushstrokes that they paint intuitively and in their own unique, inimitable way. If you think of like Van Gogh or John Singer Sargent or Georgia O'Keeffe, painters need to put in a lot of time practicing their brushstrokes. And similarly, for anyone who really wants to improve their writing, putting in time, working at the sentence level is one of the most important things you do. It's one of the best investments that you can make in terms of developing your own authority and voice as a writer. So my goal here is to give you an idea of in these next today and then in the next 2 sessions after that of the musical potential of sentences, the ways that they can harness the raw materials of the English language to raise your writing up to a new level. Because that's the great thing about writing. It is a lifelong pursuit. Even if you're already pretty good, you can always get better. And especially these days, given the focus on voice, if you ever have something that you want to publish, that's what editors and agents they're always talking about voice. Well, voice, of course, takes place on the sentence level. So we're going to be zooming in. We're going to be looking at sentences not just as zooming, I mean like focusing in and zooming. Sentences not just as part of larger works, but also as discrete units of prose, as the basic building block or ski turn or brushstroke of the writing craft. Because looking at sentences in this way is one of the best ways to make ourselves better writers. So we're going to break up this conceptual discussion by doing a number of exercises, which I hope will help to integrate what we're learning and add it, in a sense, to your long-term writerly repertoire. Today, we're going to be breaking them down and analyzing them on their own terms, trying to figure out what makes them effective and beginning to look at what really makes them sing. In the second lesson, which is next Saturday, we'll be looking at how to create sentence level suspense, and also on the underestimated value of cumulative syntax. In other words, how longer sentences can be both more efficient at conveying meaning than shorter sentences and more musical in some sense. And in the third lesson, which is 2 weeks from today or the following Saturday, or if you're looking at this as a recording, you just click on it. We'll look at a few higher level sentence special effects. And we'll put everything together so that you have a full set of practical tools for making your prose livelier, more effective, and more consistently lyrical. Everybody who wants to today is going to have the opportunity to read some of the sentences on the handout aloud. And the reasons for this are, 1, so you don't get sick of hearing me drone on, and 2, because reading aloud is really important for writers. It's a great way to catch the sort of infectious rhythms of great writing. And it's also just a good habit to get into if you're going to be a writer, is reading your work aloud as much as possible, because writing is a representation of the spoken word. And obviously, so if you speak it aloud, it makes you a better writer. And finally, a quick word about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's extremely important that we see more representation across publishing of writers from many different cultural backgrounds. And it's both enriching and useful for us as writers to seek out the writing of authors whose identities are different than our own. So if you have suggestions of sentences from authors, authors that you've read that you think might be relevant to the kind of content and techniques we'll be discussing today or in the future classes, please don't hesitate to email them to me so that I can incorporate them in future versions of the series. Okay, everybody ready to go after that long preamble? Okay, good. So I just want to double check because I always tend to forget to double check. Okay, good. It doesn't look like we have anybody trying to enter at the moment. All right, so I want to begin with these quotes from good sentence writers, just to start turning our creative minds toward the topics. And I'll read these quotes. From John Cheever: "Every sentence is an innovation." From James Baldwin: "You want to write a sentence as clean as a bone. That is the goal, James Baldwin. And from Robert Graves, there's no such thing as good writing, only good rewriting. So I love the Cheever quote because it really zeroes in on sentences as a unit. And it addresses the truth that a sentence isn't just a unit of work, it's a unit of art, something that can be innovated. And I think this is a really good mindset for us to, begin this discussion with. I also love the Baldwin quote because it assumes the possibility and sort of sets the goal that a sentence could be a thing of perfection. And in this perfection is beauty. And I love the Graves quote because it acknowledges something that every good writer knows. Revision or rewriting, for me, revision and rewriting are pretty much the same thing, is 99% of the job. It tells us that it's okay to write sentences that aren't perfect, that imperfect sentences are better than no sentences at all, actually quite a lot better. And that once we have something on the page, we have a real opportunity to make it better. And all this pretty nicely encompasses my guiding philosophy for this series of lessons. So before I move on, any thoughts? Does anyone have any thoughts on those quotes? Did anything, and did sort of bring anything to mind that you want to make sure that we discuss? Oh, I do have someone waiting. Let me add this person. Hi, Teresa. Nice to see you. You came in at exactly the right time. We just did the sort of, introduction and preamble and read the quotes at the beginning of your handout. And now we're going to really jump into the meat of the issue here. So welcome. Okay, so, please, and also please don't worry so much about retaining every last bit of information that we're going to cover. All the sentences that we're going to look at are on your handout. You might even think of this less as a class or a lesson and more as a sort of sentence writing mental workout. Or you can choose to just relax and think of it as nothing more than just a fun thought experiment. Because in the end, you're going to be a better sentence writer if you approach the whole process with an attitude of play. Have fun with it. We'll also be doing a number of brief exercises, as I mentioned, in order to demonstrate the points that we'll be talking about and to integrate it, to help you to try to integrate this into your practice as a writer. And so for that reason, I encourage you to use your own work as a resource. In the letter, as I mentioned, if you have it available, bring it in. And it's especially good to use some sentences that you may subconsciously or consciously feel are actually quite good. You may feel, we tend to, when we see things in print, this is kind of maybe the disadvantage of having a word processor. When we see things in print, they look so beautiful. And so, it almost looks like they're set in stone. Sometimes revisiting sentences like this that you sort of have subconsciously come to think of are set in stone can be really good, because even with a good sentence, there's a potential to crack it open and really make it sing. And that's the goal of what we're going to try to do in these lessons. And again, so my hope is that after these lessons settle in, maybe a few months down the line, you will be a better sentence writer. And even more to the point, as that Robert Graves quote we just read, you'll be a better sentence rewriter with more flexibility and power in the way that you use your own unique writing voice. I can tell you that, having looked into this stuff several years ago to kind of gather this material together, it has definitely made me a better writer, in general, but also especially in the late drafts. Like when I do a novel and I'm sort of in that last draft, I feel good about the structure of the story and the characters and everything, but I really want to sort of rewrite on the sentence level, keeping these things that we're going to be talking about in these next 3 lessons in mind. It's a really great arsenal or toolbox for you to use. But there's really nothing at stake today. So have fun with the sentences you'll be writing and also the ones that you'll be reading. Who knows what you'll discover. Okay, so before I dive in, any last minute questions about approach, content, etc.? Okay, well, welcome, and let's just dive into the sentences then. So the topic today is we're going to be taking sentences out of context, or sort of out of context today. Later, especially in lesson 3, we'll be talking about sentences in context, about varying the length of sentences, how to use them together to reach new levels of clarity, to capture emotions and emotional accuracy, meaning and musicality in context. But for now, I want to stay focused on the sentence as a singular, isolated, standalone unit of prose. So the topic today is 3 core qualities of good sentences. And those 3 core qualities, spoiler alert, which you already know from your handout, are economy, specificity, and musicality. So I want to go through them one by one. And for each of them, we'll see, assuming that we have time, we'll do a little exercise to kind of integrate what we're talking about. All right. So the first one is economy. And we have this wonderful quote from Francine Prose, who says, "For any writer, the ability to look at a sentence and see what's superfluous, what can be altered, revised, expanded, and especially cut, is essential. It's satisfying to see that sentence shrink, snap into place, and ultimately emerge in a more polished form, clear, economical, sharp." And this kind of goes back to that James Baldwin quote that we had at the beginning. The goal of a sentence is to make it as clean as a bone, right? So this is when we're talking about economy. That's what we're talking about. Does anybody have examples of words that you find yourself cutting, words that you use a lot that you find yourself cutting in revision? Lisa?
Soft. I've been revising a novel and I did word search. Soft. It's like a default word.
Interesting. So that's a word that you use a lot and maybe overuse. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Anyone else? Words or also if there are parts of speech that you tend to excise. How about vary? I mean, vary is a common one. That's sort of like often you don't need vary. But the point I want to make anyway today is that I do think I find that it is almost always possible to cut words, and it is almost always a good idea to cut words in late revisions. Maybe it's not necessarily a good idea to focus on that too much in early drafts, but it's almost always possible to cut words. But one thing that we may not think about, and the one reason that I discourage writers from making those wholesale search and destroy type cuts, where you do search a word and you say, okay, I'm just going to cut every instance of this. I see writers go on Twitter and say, oh, I just did a revision and I just cut every single instance of the word X. And I'm like, don't do that, because if you cut too much, you risk hobbling the meaning of some of your sentences. And writing is an art where precision and clarity are supremely important, but there is such a thing as cutting too much. And one of my pet peeves in this regard has to do with the word had as a way of distinguishing different past tense timelines. So for example, this goes to your handout here. We have the example, I had gone to the play and then I went to bed. Could easily be boiled down to or cut down to, I went to the play and then I went to bed. This is a good cut, right? That original sentence wasn't that great, but this is a good cut because it uses less words without negatively affecting the clarity of the sentence, right? The timeline is still very clear. We don't have any confusion about when any of this was happening, do we? So that's a good cut. But the second one, the next one, which is the reverse. So I had waited on the corner for 3 hours by the time she finally showed up. And then the cut version is, if you cut the word had, and a few other extras, is I waited on the corner for 3 hours when she showed up. So, okay, this is not a good cut, right? Obviously, this is not a sentence that any of us would write, but it's not a good cut because, yes, it is more economical in that it says basically the same thing in fewer words, but it's confusing. The first sentence gives us a nuanced and precise accounting of the timeline. I had waited on the corner for 3 hours by the time she finally showed up. Or you could say I had been waiting on the corner for 3 hours by the time she finally showed up, right? The second sentence, in addition to just sounding awkward, I waited on the corner for 3 hours when she showed up, gives us a muddied, sort of blurry and imprecise version of the timeline. Had is not an extra word if it clarifies the chronology. It's a necessary word in that it places us in a specific place in time. And, so if we're writing in the past tense, we have to acknowledge that if our story or whatever we're writing about takes place in the past tense, there's a timeline beyond that, further back, right? And we have to distinguish between those two timelines. If we don't, it's going to be, oh, I'm going to let Claire in here. If you don't do that, it's going to be confusing. So, I kept seeing this in the reason that I bring this up is it's not because it is a pet peeve, but hi, Claire, welcome. Okay, because I see this a lot, so I told you that I work in an MFA program. I see this in a lot of the writing that I read. And I just maybe even just a couple of months ago, I was like, why is this happening? And someone said, yeah, there's something in Microsoft Word that lights up the word had, and sort of like it doesn't give you red, it gives you blue, telling you this is something you should think about cutting. And so a lot of people, I think, are using Microsoft Word to override their good sense and are taking out the word had, and therefore, and what they're doing is they're ending up with a narrative that is yes, maybe has less words, but is less clear. You get a lot of stuff like, I waited on the corner for 3 hours when she showed up. They're like, oh, I got rid of the word had. Yay, okay. But the person reading it is like, wait, this is blurry. And even if the person reading it can sort of get the gist of what's being said, it's not a precise use of the language. And so it's not a good cut. Okay. So that's just one example. If by cutting our words, we've made our prose less clear, not more, then we've made a mistake. We've cut too deeply. So make sure you're not doing that. Another example of this, okay, when we strive for economy, we're often, told to really be skeptical of adverbs. And some people even go so far as to say, well, I'm just going to go in wholesale and cut all my adverbs. Well, I don't know. Okay, that's not something I advocate, because adverbs are a part of the English language. They exist to accomplish very specific things. You just have to use them well. So to paraphrase John Gardner, adverbs are either the dullest tool or the sharpest in the writer's toolbox. The key is that they have to be pulling their weight. And if you run into another writer who's really skeptical of adverbs and says, oh, I really just try not to use any adverbs in my work, have them pull down a copy of The Great Gatsby and open it up to basically any page in the entire book and circle all the adverbs. The book will be completely marked up, because Fitzgerald was a great user of adverbs. So I want to actually look at a case of this and sort of look at a sort of case of false economy. Will someone read us this excerpt from The Great Gatsby? Volunteer.
Well,
yay. Okay, Marianne, go ahead.
Do you just want the first example?
Just the first one. This is the first one for now, yeah.
The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone, and yet to avoid all eyes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you see all those adverbs? I mean, would you have been tempted to cut some of those? I would have been, maybe. I would have been, wow, there's a lot of adverbs in here. I would have been tempted to cut some of those. So, well, let's see what happens to the passage when these adverbs are completely cut out. Marianne, will you give us the next verse?
Sure. The telephone rang inside, and as Daisy shook her head at Tom, the subject of stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, and I was conscious of wanting to look at everyone, and yet to avoid all eyes.
Okay, so it's subtle, but what can we say about this second short sentence, besides the fact that it is shorter, right? So it's technically more economical. But what, if anything, have we lost by cutting those adverbs? Any ideas?
I think we've lost a little bit of music.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that maybe we've lost something rhythmically, the way that those adverbs sort of, modulate the rhythm of the sentence and the sort of music as it comes out. That's a good point. Yeah. What else?
We've lost some of the emotional flavor.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
startling, like the telephone rang and it was startling, and I wouldn't know that otherwise.
Yeah.
Daisy shook her head decisively.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
Wanting to look squarely at everyone, wanting, I
Right.
mean, that really adds a lot. I
Yeah.
don't know, it's really it gives the emotional detail.
Exactly. Emotional detail or the nuance, right? And
Yeah.
so, Fitzgerald is really, well known for creating wonderful, incredibly complex, nuanced characters. And if we cut those adverbs, we're losing quite a lot of that nuance. We don't really know necessarily what we're supposed to make of this scene now. It's become a little more generic, a little more colorless or less colorful, devoid of some of its original meaning. And so this would be, I would categorize this as a bad cut. Those adverbs are there to give us nuance on the characters, the way they're interacting, the way that things are feeling, that startling phone ringing, it's giving us the sort of emotional perspective of the character who's observing. Does that make sense? I mean, this is, we're sort of taking for granted that, one of the core qualities of good sentences is economy. And the reason that I'm sort of talking about how, warning you to avoid cutting too much is that that's what I see a lot of, is that we do have this premium on economy. I think most writers understand that you want to be as economical as you can and not use extra words and things like that. But that if you are cutting too much, you end up with prose that can feel awkward and sort of hobbled and devoid of some of the meaning that it would otherwise have. I'm the key is, I think, for me, is adverbs have to carry their own weight. It can't be, I'm really mad at you, he said angrily, right? That's not a good adverb. It's like, we don't need that, right? We're seeing it through the dialogue, right? But setting out to purge adverbs from your writing entirely would be a huge mistake, because they're part of the language, as is that word had. And so what we're trying to do here is to, yes, make our sentences clean as a bone, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to mix metaphors. Right?
Can I comment? Also, maybe it's very similar to the last comment, but for me, because I've been writing in the first person for way too long, I'm often feeling the need to use adverbs for that first person to maybe exemplify his feelings at the time. And without that, I struggle. Maybe I need to use better verbs or what have you, but I often start, my first draft has those adverbs in it. And then because of all the hammering I've heard over the years in the classes to take out the adverbs, I do scrub them. So
yeah.
So this is at least you're giving us permission to reconsider this. So
good. I'm glad that message is being received, because that is what I'm trying to do. Because I do feel like these days it's much more common to have people err on the side of being of cutting too much, having been too economical. You still you do want to have no extra words and have your sentence be clean as a bone, but you want all the nuances of meaning that you intended to be there, not to have to be assumed or pieced together by the reader, is my view. Okay, so economy is important. Cut until the sentence is clean as a bone. But how do we know when we've taken cutting too far? And the answer is when we start sacrificing meaning. When we start sacrificing meaning, we've cut too far. So economy is a worthy core principle of good sentences, a really important one. But it is one I think that our society has already kind of got. We get the idea that brevity is good, but just don't cut to the point where you risk hobbling your own expressive power by oversimplifying the language. The language has complexity for a reason. I actually have a poet friend who says, and I love this. This is, I think, anyone who's trying to write should listen to this. He says, let the rose bush grow wild before you trim it back. And I think that's very wise when it comes to writing in general, but especially sentences. So let them grow wild a bit before you start cutting them. I mean, I think oftentimes we're like, okay, I want my prose to be as clear and clean as Raymond Carver or Hemingway or, whatever. And so but that process happens too early. The cutting happens too early. Sometimes you just have to kind of let them grow, and then you can trim them back. See where they want to take you. Let them surprise you as they develop in their wildness and their richness, and then you can trim them back, looking for that economy. Okay, that's my view. So you can listen to E.B. White on this too. Writing is not an exercise in excision. It's a journey into sound. How about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? One tomorrow would suffice, but it's the other two that have made the thing immortal. And that is because that writer let the rose bush grow wild and said, what if I did a sentence that said tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? And it's like, yeah, that's amazing. And this also reminds me of something that I want in general that I want to get across in all three of these lessons. And that is when it comes to sentences, rules are meant to be broken. There are rules, but in fact, I don't think there are any rules in writing. I mean, there are rules that can make our job easier, that are things to, give us sort of guidelines, but rules are meant to be broken, and hewing too zealously to perfect grammar can lead to mediocre writing. Actually, I love this quote. Will someone read us this quote from Raymond Chandler? This is a letter that he wrote to his book editor when he got some copy edits back. Would someone want to read this for us? David.
Would you convey my compliments to the purist who reads your proofs, and tell him or her that I write in a sort of broken down patois, my French, which is something like the way a Swiss waiter talks, and that when I split an infinitive, God damn it, I split it so it will stay split. And when I interrupt the velvety smoothness of my more or less literate syntax with a few sudden words of barroom vernacular, this is done with eyes wide open and the mind relaxed but attentive.
Isn't that great? I love that. It's so great. And, that's the kind of letter I would love to send to an editor. But so this is sort of, let's go forward in the spirit of Raymond Chandler here and E.B. White. So another example, just, sort of belabor this a little bit, but let's talk about semicolons. Okay. Does anybody have an idea about when a semicolon is supposed to be used? Like, when is a semicolon appropriate? I mean,
sentences.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Compound sentences, when you have sentences with parentheses and you want to have a list, and each part of the list has commas in it.
Yeah, well, so yeah, exactly. So that's exactly right. So that's one use of them, just to sort of distinguish the fact that you've got this list, but it's making it easier to parse the list that has a lot of commas. Some of the elements of the list are long and have commas, so the semicolon kind of separates them out, right? Other ideas about when you're supposed to use it? Yeah, Lisa.
I think if you have two sentences that are pretty related, and you can just put a semicolon instead of a.
Yes, exactly. That's really that's the main sort of grammatical use, and it's true that you have two related sentences. Well, they could be full sentences. They could stand on their own as full sentences. Noun, verb, subject. And yet they're closely related, and so you want to sort of link them together more than they would be if there was a period there, right? So those are good. But let's look at this next one. This is from Garth Greenwell, and he's a really great contemporary stylist. Will someone read us this sentence from Garth Greenwell, and pay particular attention to that one semicolon in there? Anyone? Yeah, Lee.
And maybe there actually was something saintly about him, his slightness and quiet in the hoodie that framed his face like a monk's cowl when I saw him that first time, or in the bathrobe he wrapped around himself later when I came to his door. And maybe there was something saintly in his endurance too. I think there was, in his desire for pain.
Okay, great. So you see that semicolon there? It's not strictly correct in terms of what we're talking about. It's not linking to, I guess it sort of is linking to sentences. Maybe there were something, but they're not really standalone sentences. But so regardless of whether it's grammatically correct, do you see the function that it's serving in the text of the sentence? Like as you read that, and Lee read it very well, do you see what function is it serving in that sentence?
Well, you have a repetition. There's something saintly about him. There's something saintly in his endurance.
Yeah.
So each part of it, of those two things are explained separately but connected.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. I didn't even see that, but it's true. There's something saintly is a link. We're actually going to be talking about repetition in a moment. But for me, I think it was more. It's a little more. It's a little less kind of pat and harder to sort of discuss. But basically, what it does when you read it, you read it in a really nice rhythm with really nice timing. And what he's trying to communicate with the semicolon is there's a pause there. He wants you to pause, but he doesn't want you to come to a full stop. It's a pause in the middle of a thought. So it just feels right. It's kind of like this thing where it's sort of like it's a pause that's, longer than a comma, but shorter than a period. And that just feels right. And it's okay to do that. I think, basically just giving us permission to do that if there's a pause, it's not a full stop, it's just a pause in the middle of a thought, it just feels right. And regardless of the rules. So sometimes punctuation isn't really about what's correct. It's about the passage of time. And of course, I would say that it's very likely that Greenwell read this aloud to himself when, late in his draft, was like, yeah, I'm going to put a semicolon there because I'm pausing a little bit more than a comma, and that's the kind of sensitivity that reading your own work, your own sentences aloud can give you. So simply playing with the sound and rhythm and music of speech. Okay.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that I think that pause is like the threshold. He comes to the door, and the punctuation in this case is actually underlining the motion, the actual motion that's being described.
That's exactly right. He comes, yeah, this is an example of something we're going to be talking about a lot actually in the third lesson, which is sentences that sing the meaning of themselves. It's a sentence that's sort of embodying the action. And don't worry, we'll be talking about this a lot, but that's a really great, very perceptive point.
And maybe you're telling us this, maybe we're hearing it, but can you just like flip it and tell us what you think would happen here if we broke it into two sentences instead? If the writer left it as two, perhaps he wrote it as two sentences, right?
Yeah, I mean, he may have, or he may have just written it with a comma. Yeah, I think, in Greenwell's view, and in my view too, there's a lot of movement in this sentence, and it's sort of like a continuous thought, and putting a period there would break that up in a different way. It would set across. It would be perfectly correct to do that, and it probably wouldn't be bad, but it would be doing something different than the sort of the effect that he was trying to create. Set off that second sentence more. Yeah, Lisa.
Oh, he's also moving from a kind of visual description, the monk's cowl, the bathrobe, and then there's the colon, and then he goes more internal to the man's endurance. So it kind of is a nice slight divide between the inner and the outer and the inner.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so all of these things are great points. And it basically, it's really good to be thinking about this because, looking at things with this level of detail in your own sentences is a really good idea. Even though someone reading this Garth Greenwell story is not going to notice this, they will subconsciously notice it. But you as a writer, paying this level of detail to your sentences, and also giving yourself permission to break the rules in the interest of rhythm, timing, just the way that you want it to go down is a good practice in my view. So let's just take a quick break, and just very quickly, if you have some of your own work available, find a paragraph in your work that feels like it might be wordy or that you like, cut all the adverbs and then just read it to yourself very quickly. Okay. Cut all the adverbs, cut any other modifiers that you can. Okay. Like even, if you want to cut some of the adjectives, this is an exercise called chastity. Okay. So just spend about 5 minutes doing this and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it. Okay. So just quickly pick something out. If you don't have something, just make something up. Okay. So we'll come back at like 1:45. Okay. Welcome back. Sorry if that didn't give you very much time, but hopefully that was something useful. What did you guys think? What did you notice? Any sort of any note? Were there any cuts that you were like, yeah, that's a good cut? Yeah, Claire. You're muted. You're still muted.
Am
There you
I okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I had two adverbs, I believe. I can bring it up on the screen. And in this case, I thought they worked.
Good. So you cut them and
So-
then you're, nope, I'm putting them back.
Yeah, yeah,
Good.
yeah.
How about anybody else? Did anyone get, it's a good exercise to do, I think, but
Yeah, I think it is.
not, yeah, Marianne, you had something.
Yes, one adverb I would put back in. The adverb was contemptuously,
Mhm.
and I don't think that the meaning would not have been there. And again, it's about an emotion, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
The other one is literally unthinkable, and I really don't think we need literally.
Good. So that's a good discovery. That's
Yeah.
progress.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So that's a great exercise. That's actually an exercise from Ursula K. Le Guin that she calls chastity. So that sort of wraps it up for economy. I noticed while I was gone, Claire, I was checking my email and I saw that message from you that you were having trouble getting in. So
Yeah.
for you, and also for Victoria and anyone else who is, in the class and is not watching, you will receive a video of this
Right.
class on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, and then you can watch whatever you missed. So.
Oh, good, good. Thanks. Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about one of the core principles of great sentences, and that is economy. And that, in some ways that's the most obvious one. I do think that's the one that's most culturally, that is most culturally common. And I think it is important to do what we did and to really question just wholesale cutting. If you're cutting too much, it affects the meaning. You don't want to cut to the point that it affects the meaning. And that's surprisingly common. But let's move on to the second one, which is specificity. So we have these little examples on your handout from Strunk and White. A period of unfavorable weather set in versus it rained every day for a week. Do you see how the second one is more specific? Instead of unfavorable weather, we have rain. Instead of a period, we have every day for a week, okay? And then the next one is also good. He showed satisfaction as he took possession of his well-earned reward versus he grinned as he pocketed the coin, right? The second one is more specific. It's better. And not only because it's shorter though, in this case, Strunk and White are showing us that oftentimes specificity can be, can also lead to economy, which is great. But the point of specificity is to paint pictures, to let the words in your head, the words that you're sort of reading, do the work of sustaining the vivid continuous dream. Have you heard this term, the vivid continuous dream? Yeah. It's often referred to in fiction. It's a phrase that comes from John Gardner, but it could refer to any kind of narrative prose. And the point of this is that well, let's read what Stephen King had to say. Someone read us this quote from Stephen King, because he can say it better than I can. This is from his book On Writing. Will someone read us this one?
I'll read it.
Great, thank you, Claire.
We're not even in the same year together, let alone the same room, except we are together. We're close. We're having a meeting of the minds. I sent you a table with a red cloth on it, a cage, a rabbit, and the number 8 in blue ink. You got them all, especially that blue 8. We've engaged in an act of telepathy. No Mythy Mountain shit, real telepathy.
Right. Okay. So the inimitable Stephen King, but what he's saying is that, I think this bears repeating, I think we all know this, but he's saying that human beings are creatures of the imagination, and our ability to imagine things, to tell stories about things, is a big part of what sets us apart, or maybe sets us apart as a species. So we have these very powerful, we might even say overactive imaginations. And they're so powerful that when we are presented with vivid, concrete, specific sensory information or imagery, our individual imaginations go about constructing and projecting this imagery in our mind's eye without our knowing it, and even against our will. This is fully taking place, in a fully unconscious or subconscious arena. So we start with black marks on a white page, and then suddenly we're no longer seeing the page. Instead, our imagination is scrolling this vivid, continuous dream of good prose. And this is what King is calling telepathy. And it's very powerful stuff. And in fact, I think it's the closest that we have to a storytelling superpower, this ability to harness the human imagination using vivid, concrete, specific sensory information. Does this make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so let's look some examples on a sentence level. There's George Saunders wrote a great craft book. Some of you may have read it, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. And he wrote a sentence. He sort of took a sentence of Tolstoy's and wrote it the way he would have written it. Maybe in an early draft. He said, "The maid carried the samovar to the table." But the way that Tolstoy actually wrote that sentence is really telling. Tolstoy wrote, "After flicking with her apron the top of the samovar, which was now boiling over, she carried it with an effort to the table, raised it, and set it down with a thud." But now we're getting away from economy, aren't we? And this is a cardinal sin in contemporary writing circles, perhaps. But it's really, you see how much better it is, how much richer it is, and what makes it richer. It's the added specificity that's doing it, isn't it? It's creating this image in our mind. We're actually in the scene with this samovar being put down on the table with a thud. We see the servant, the maid, flicking her apron, and we see the samovar boiling over. All of these things we would not have seen, and we didn't see it all in that first sentence. And so it is the added, concrete, vivid sensory detail, the specificity, the added specificity that Tolstoy is using to take this basic sentence from something pedestrian to something more gripping and more immersive in the sense of putting us into this vivid, continuous dream. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Feel free to disagree with me, but I think that Saunders really he called it here that this is a good thing. So let's do it. Let's reverse engineer a couple more sentences that I've sort of randomly pulled out of works of literature to sort of illustrate the point. Who will read us this sentence from Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass? Lisa.
Great swaths of incandescence trembled and parted like angels' wings beating. Cascades of luminescent glory tumbled down invisible crags to lie in swirling pools or hang like cast waterfalls.
Okay, great. Now give us not Pullman.
The light of the aurora borealis moved across the sky.
Okay, great. So you see what we're doing. We're reverse engineering these to take away some of the specificity. Who will give us Ernest Hemingway's sentence from A Farewell to Arms? Don't be intimidated. Yeah, Teresa.
Okay. Who'd you call it?
Yes, Teresa.
Yeah. I had gone to no place where the roads were frozen and hard as iron, where it was clear, cold, and dry, and the snow was dry and powdery, and hair tracks in the snow, and the peasants took off their hats and called you Lord, and there was good hunting.
Great. Now, can you read us not Hemingway?
I didn't go where it was winter, where the people treated you with respect, and there were good opportunities for outdoor sports.
Right. Okay, good. So we're taking down Hemingway here. Okay, how about Toni Morrison? Will someone read us this sentence from Toni Morrison's Jazz? Yeah, David.
Morrison, the clarinets had trouble because the brass was cut so fine, not low down the way they love to do it, but high and fine, like a young girl singing by the side of a creek, passing time, her ankles cold in the water. Not Morrison. The wind instruments were less effective because the brass instruments were more skillfully played.
Well, that's what she's saying, right? So, come on. So it illustrates the point. And this is the most important lesson that we're talking about, is that good sentences eschew the vague and the general in favor of the specific and the particular. And this is probably, I think, the single most important thing that you can do to take your writing up to the next level. And that is to really understand this on a really sort of continuous level as you're not necessarily don't worry when you're writing a first draft. In the first draft, it's okay to write the kind of lessons that we just reversed engineered, the kind of sentences. But then in a revision, you want to write sentences that are really specific and paint images in your reader's mind. Okay. So that's the second major principle. I'm going to actually give this next exercise to you as something that I would like you to do later if you want, because I want to just make sure that we cover everything and then we can come back if we have time. But the writing exercise is to take a sentence or a couple sentences from your own work that you're not fully satisfied with and rewrite them, focusing just on making them as concrete, vivid, and specific as possible. Okay. So just make a note to do that later. We may have time at the end. I just want to make double sure that we cover everything. Okay. Any further thoughts or questions?
Do you have a instructions recipe for how we can make our sentences to the more specific and make them sound as beautiful as some of these past examples are?
Well, yes, my instruction is to come back for the next 2 lessons, because that's really what we're going to be talking about is
Okay,
musicality,
great.
right? And these were musical sentences. We haven't really talked about why though, so we're going to talk about that. So, but yeah, but for now, I mean, even if you just focus on specificity, that's more than half the battle. And I say this as much to myself as everyone else. When I'm writing a first draft of anything, and even second, third draft, there are a lot of sentences in there that could be a lot more specific than they are. It's like you're walking down the street and you see a tree. Okay, that's good. But what kind of tree is it? I mean, get a specific, dig down into the specificity. What does it look like? I mean, it's this question of painting pictures in your reader's mind to make sure that you're creating this vivid, continuous dream. Okay. So the third core quality of good sentences that I want to discuss today is musicality. And actually, this is a topic that we're going to return to again and again from here on out as we go through the series, because it's in some ways the most complex, in some ways the most difficult, and in some ways also the most rewarding one. So we may ask, why the music metaphor? Why musicality? Why don't we say artistic? Well, music, like narrative prose, is an art form that takes place over the dimension of time, right? It takes time to listen to a piece of music. It takes time to read a piece of art. It does not take time to see a piece of a painting. I mean, it does take time to sort of really analyze it and really get into it. But it's, what I'm saying is that like the painting takes place on the wall, you go and see it, but music and writing both play out over the dimension of time. Without the dimension of time, they would not exist. And so this is something that music and writing share in common. And also they're both abstract art forms, meaning that they, again, they're not written, they're not painted on a canvas or performed on a dance floor, but they play out fully in our minds, in our imagination. We're listening to a piece of music. Doesn't matter where we are. We could have headphones on and we're in this most glorious thing, but it's abstract in that it's playing out all in our minds. The same with a piece of writing. It's just playing out in our minds. It's not the words on the page. I mean, they're essential, as a way of communicating the art form, but really the art form is actually taking place inside our minds, right? So that these commonalities make writing and music, they're sort of, they make it possible for these two art forms to share a lot. And so, I think we're going to continue to come back to the music metaphor, because I do think that there's a lot that we can learn from music. But the idea of musicality in this context it's really one of the keys to writing sentences that transcend normal communication, sentences that edge toward poetry, that emerge from the workaday into the realm of art. And musical sentences are one of the main things that makes great stories, novels, speeches, essays great. And it's the wonderful thing about it is there are many concrete methods for creating musical sentences that we can apply directly to our own work. So that's the good news. You don't have to be a sort of, born genius to start using some of these things. So we're going to get started on musicality today, and then we're going to continue and expand what we're learning into the next 2 sessions. To begin with today, I want to focus specifically on rhythm. To go back to that music metaphor, you can think of rhythm, the rhythm of sentences, as a kind of ground bass or drum beat underlying the melody. You know, the sentence's rhythm has to do with the way it is built and the way we read it, and how, especially how it plays out and echoes in our minds. So, you know, when David just said, well, how do we write like Hemingway? Well, you know, or Toni Morrison, a big part of that is the rhythm, the way that they have sort of mastered the rhythm, and that sentence continues to sort of resonate in our mind. We're like, damn, there's something really beautiful in that. And a lot of that is about rhythm. And so, we'll talk about rhythm. We'll talk about rhythm today, and there are some other things that I want to talk about having to do with rhythm that we'll talk about in the third lesson. But let's talk about some concrete rhythmical things that we can do for our sentences. Will someone read us this this sentence from John Gardner's The Art of Fiction? Yeah, Marianne.
Knowledge is no substitute for genius, but genius supported by vast technique makes a literary master. Okay,
great. So do you see how the repetition of the word genius draws our attention to that word? Like, yeah, that's the word that after Marianne read that sentence, it was the word genius that kind of stuck in our minds because it's the repeated word. So that, you know, so this is the power of repetition. And another thing that Gardner's sentence shows us is that a repeated word not only draws attention to that one word. By repeating it, you're drawing attention to it. It also establishes a strong linkage between otherwise unrelated causes. And this is what I think, who was it? Lisa, someone pointed out about the Garth Greenwell passage. It's the repetition of a word or a phrase can link otherwise unrelated parts of a sentence. Do we see how that works here? If you look at those two clauses, knowledge is no substitute for genius. Well, let's not call it genius in the next one. Let's say, but ability supported by vast technique makes a literary master. You see how that sort of, now they're kind of unrelated. It's the genius, it's the repetition of the word genius that pulls those two parts of the sentence together, right? Someone read us this one from Toni Morrison, just to give us another example of this from Toni Morrison's Beloved. Anyone?
Sure.
Victoria, great.
Who?
Victoria?
In this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass.
Great, thank you. So do you see what's making this sentence work? You know, it's a sentence that has this musical for a lot of reasons, but above all, it's the repetition of the word flesh, which kind of leaves this palpable echo in our minds. It's repeated 3 times. So that word repeated 3 times rises to the surface of our consciousness as the you know, the word that we remember most from that sentence. But it's also doing exactly what the Gardner thing did. It is linking those 3 parts of that sentence, and they're sort of linking these 3 disparate clauses tightly together, so it all feels very much of a piece. Do we see this? Does that make sense? So repetition, you know, and so it's also just, you know, simply a rhythm. And this, you know, Victoria read it very well. It's a very rhythmical sentence, and part of the reason it's rhythmical is because of the meter, which we'll talk about in not the next one, but the final one. But it's also this repetition of the word genius. It's like a drum beat. It's a pattern. Okay. And any thoughts on that on repetition? We'll be coming back to it because repetition is a really important technique when it comes to musicality. But let's talk to something related. This is a parallelism. And this is another thing that you can use to endow your sentences with a stronger and more pleasing rhythm. So Strunk and White, you know, gives the famous example. Formerly, science was taught by the textbook method, while now the laboratory method is employed, versus formerly, science was taught by the textbook method. Now it is taught by the laboratory method. Does everyone see the difference? Mm-hmm. The parallelism here creates a much nicer rhythm, doesn't it? It makes the sentence play out more pleasantly in the reader's ear. And it also kind of oddly makes it clearer and easier to understand on a first reading. Do you see this? And that's a question we might ask ourselves, like, why is that so? This repetition and using the same language, or variation of the same language again and again, why does that make it clear? And we'll talk about this in a moment. It makes it not only clear, but easier to parse, easier for us to understand. But before we do that, a really common mistake in parallelism, and it comes in lists. Okay, so you could say in spring, summer, or in winter, but that's kind of awkward. But you should probably say in spring, summer, or winter, or in spring, in summer, or in winter. Do you see how that is that's parallelism? That's just something to keep in mind. That'll keep things neater if you use lists to keep them parallel. And it's really a question of rhythm. But now let's look at a more complicated use of parallelism. Will someone read us this sentence from Lauren Isley's The Immense Journey? Anyone?
I can do.
Yeah, Teresa, thank you.
I used to park my car on a hill and sit silently observant, listening to the talk ringing out from neighbor to neighbor, seeing the inhabitants drowsing in their doorways, talking it all in with nostalgia, the sage smell of the wind, the sunlight without time, the village without destiny.
Okay, thank you. So how does this sentence strike you? Does it feel sort of harmonious and well balanced and sort of musical?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really lovely sentence. And if you break it down, you see that a lot of this is just due to Isley's use of parallelism. So on your handout, I think you might have to flip a page, or I don't know where it is on your handout, but I made you a little diagram just to see how it's working. And let me read it to you as you read this diagram. I used to park my car on a hill and sit silently observant, listening to the talk ringing out from neighbor to neighbor, seeing the inhabitants drowsing in their doorways, taking it all in with nostalgia, the sage smell of the wind, the sunlight without time, the village without destiny. So in technical terms, this is what we would call mixed cumulative syntax. Don't worry, we'll be talking about cumulative syntax a lot next week. But for now, just take a look at how each of the 3 coordinate and 3 subordinate clauses are parallel in the way they're constructed. Listening, seeing, taking. The sage smell, the sunlight, the village. So you see that parallelism? We don't necessarily see this underlying architecture when we're reading the sentence. In fact, it's probably better that we don't, because it's sort of like looking behind the curtain. But our ear definitely hears it, right? And there's a hidden beauty to the symmetry of this sentence that we find striking. So this is a great example for me of sentence level musicality created by rhythmic parallelism. Is that all clear? Yeah, Lee. Oh, you're muted.
The rhythm is enhanced by ing ending words in 2 of the lists and 2 of the subordinate clauses.
Yeah.
So the bringing and the browsing.
Yes. Yeah. Very, very true. And that's sort of an echo of what we got in the first ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so we'll talk a lot more about cumulative syntax because it's kind of a magical thing. But I want to talk more about why this kind of thing is intrinsically mesmerizing, and why when you read patterned language like this, rhythmically patterned, parallelism, repetition, it makes the prose clearer, not only more musical, but easier to understand. So why is it that we can sit and watch a campfire for hours at a time, or sit at the beach and watch the waves come in? What is it about doing those things that makes them, that we don't get, at least I can sit there and watch the waves for a long time. Why is that? Well, it's because we're mesmerized by, we like patterns. We're programmed to notice patterns. Patterns allow our minds to rest. But at the same time, when you have waves coming in at a seashore or a campfire, you have a pattern it's the same thing over and over again. And that allows your mind a chance to rest. You're like, okay, here it comes. I see this in another way. But there's also endless variation. So it's sort of variation superimposed on pattern. There's something fascinating about variation. So campfires and waves are examples of pattern with variation. And of course, music is another example, because music always has a beat, right? The drums, the ground bass. And if you were just to listen to those tracks, just listen to the tracks of your favorite song, just the drums of your favorite song, it would sound kind of repetitive. It might be mesmerizing in a certain way, but there would be very little variation. But so you have this sort of pattern underneath the ground bass, the beat, but then you have the variation, which is the melody, which also repeats itself. So it's just endless. If you listen to a Bach, a Bach fugue, it's this endless sort of pattern, this repetition, but it's also endless variation. And so pattern and variation in writing is just magic, because pattern creates the structure, giving the mind a chance to rest, making it easy as possible for the reader to listen, to recognize the meaning. So the mind is resting, and it's freer to contemplate the meaning of what you're saying, rather than just getting stuck in a jumble of words that don't really have a pleasing or memorable shape or sound. But variation is important too, because it creates interest and invests things with a sense of movement. And in the Isley sentence that we just read, it is pattern and variation. We already just saw the patterns, right? But we also have these variations within the pattern. So it's kind of flowing like a river, and we can rest a little and take in the scenery as we're getting swept down that rhythmical river, without having to be on the lookout for unexpected obstacles or sudden stops or starts in the current. You know what I mean? So I'm not necessarily explaining this well, but hopefully it's pretty intuitive. Pattern and variation is the explanation for why a sentence like that is so mesmerizing to us, and sort of, it's behind the musicality. Any thoughts or questions at this point? Is this making sense? So pattern and variation is a great tool for us. But sticking on with this idea of sentence rhythm, let's take a look at a few more complex ways to incorporate these intrinsically mesmerizing patterns and variation in sentences. So the first one is anaphora. Don't worry about the jargon, but poetic anaphora is a rhythmic pattern that also gives the mind a chance to rest during it's often used during what otherwise might be really dense, complex, or random passage down a river of words. But anaphora can also be evocative, almost incantatory. Will someone read us this first example from Wallace Stegner's Marking the Sparrow's Fall? Yeah, David.
Nothing between them and the stars, nothing between them and the North Pole, nothing between them and the wolves, except a 12 by 16 house of cloth, so thin that every wind moved it, and light showed through it, and the shadows of men helped angling along its slope. Its roof so peppered with spark holes that lying in their beds, they caught squinting glimpses of the stars.
Great. Okay, so just notice, this is pretty subtle, but do you see how the repeated phrase of nothing between them and, when David read the first thing, nothing between them and this, and that establishes a pattern. And then it varies the pattern by having each clause finish differently. Nothing between them and the stars, nothing between them and the North Pole, nothing between them and the 12 by 16, thing of cloth, right? And so how it feels is almost like an incantation, right? You're getting this repeated phrase, which feels like an incantation, but also the repeated phrase is giving us a kind of foundation or launching pad to spring the sentence into a kind of lyrical resolution. It's a very musical effect. And again, it can be very effective. This kind of thing can be very effective if spoken aloud, which is one reason that it's often used in speeches and other spoken word rhetoric. Does that make sense? You're seeing the anaphora there? It's the beginning of the phrase. Well, and this is something that's often used in Native American oral tradition. And this is sort of evident a little bit in this passage from M. Scott Momaday. Will someone read us this passage from M. Scott Momaday? Yeah, Marianne, please.
Those who deny the spirit of the earth, who do not see that the earth is alive and sacred, who poison the earth and inflict wounds upon it, have no shame and are without the basic virtues of humanity. And they bring ridicule upon themselves. I am ashamed before the earth. I am ashamed before the heavens. I am ashamed before the dawn. I am ashamed before the evening light. I am ashamed before the dawn. I am ashamed before the sun. This pronouncement from the Navajo has increasing relevance in our time. Daki, let me not be ashamed before the earth.
Thank you. So that's very powerful, right? And a lot of that is the repetition, the anaphora. I am ashamed, you know, the sort of repetition of the same phrase again and again. It's incantatory. And it also is getting across a very, you know, kind of complex and very powerful message in a relatively economical way. So we're seeing how that works. Okay, so the next one is, this is epistrophe, and epistrophe is the same as anaphora. Basically, it's just the opposite placement, and it comes at the end of the clause. And you can see this, it's a lot more subtle, but you can see this in this passage from The Grapes of Wrath. Will someone read us this passage from Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath? I'll do this one. Then I'll be around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. And when our folk eat the stuff they raise and live in the houses they build, why, I'll be there. Okay, so you see the pattern, and this is a epistrophe. It's just the same words instead of at the beginning, at the end of the clause. But the point is that, you know, if you see the pattern, right? If it were all pattern, it might grow tiresome, but because of the variation within the patterns, it makes this sentence musical or irresistible to our ear. And then the final one in this, you know, in this trilogy of poetic terms is simplicity. And simplicity is basically the two techniques at once. You have both anaphora and epistrophe working at once. Will someone read us this passage from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to give an idea of this? Yeah, Claire.
Who is here so base that would be a bondman? If any speak, for him have I offended. Who is here so rude that would not be a Roman? If any speak, for him have I offended. Who is here so vile that will not love his country? If any speak, for him have I offended.
Great, thank you. So just these techniques really endow a passage of prose with a kind of musical system of pattern and variation. And it's powerful. And that's one reason that it's often used in rhetoric, in speeches. You know, the Julius Caesar, that comes from a speech within the play. And of course, you know, it's one of the most famous speeches in classic drama, but it's also useful in argumentative essays. There's one from this recent one from Brandon Taylor, who's a short story writer. It's more subtle than Shakespeare's, but it's still using this simplicity, and it's very effective to get across a complex idea. Will someone read us this passage from Brandon Taylor? Yeah, Lisa.
Moral art is, I think, hard to describe, unstable. It is art that implicates and complicates your notions of good and bad. Moral art may call you a liar to your face. It reveals the shallowness of your thought. It challenges you, but not in the way of an all-fiber diet. In the way gravity challenges you. In the way the thin air at the top of a mountain challenges you. In the way the pressure of the deep seas challenges you. Moral does not mean good or lawful. Moral means true. Moral means you take your finger off the scale.
Great, thank you. By the way, if anybody's interested in that, I would highly recommend looking up the Brandon Taylor Substack. It's a great thing for people who are trying to write to understand what moral art really is, and he does such a great job of explaining it. But just so you see that's an example of simplicity. And it takes a complex idea, and because of this repetition, it gives our mind a chance to rest and somehow makes it more clear in our mind, in addition to just being sort of mesmerizing in its own way because of the rhythm, the pattern, and the variation of that pattern. Okay. So I guess I was optimistic that we would have more time to do writing exercises. I just want to make sure we get everything, but I'm going to give you this exercise again, another one for you to do later on as you're sort of taking all this in. And that is to find a passage in your work that you'd like to have more impact. Let's say it's something, maybe it's either a passage that you want to have more impact, or it's a passage that's getting across some kind of something complex. Maybe it's complex movement, a complex scene, or maybe it's a complex idea like what Brandon Taylor is trying to do. And then just rewrite it using, consciously using a repetitive pattern, one of the patterns we've talked about, anaphora, epistrophe, or simplicity. Or if you want, you can just use one of those patterns writing something new. Okay, but we only have 10 minutes, so I want to make sure that we get through the serial constructions, because this is another thing that's really important, and has to do very much with what we've been talking about, which is the musicality of sentences, specifically having to do with rhythm. And it's a little mysterious as to why these are effective, but they are. The first one is the rhythm of twos. You may have heard of sort of the rule of three, and that's the most common one, but let's look at the rhythm of twos first. Will someone read us this opening of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities? Yeah, Victoria, thank you.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us.
Right, thank you. So this is really memorable, right? I mean, obviously it's one of the most famous openings in literature, but it's memorable, right? And the way that it's using these pairs, a sense of balance inherent in the pairing. The rhythm of twos gives us a sense of balance, the impression of certainty, harmony, fairness, and authority. It's the duality. It's sort of getting at the sort of binary or duality nature of life, right? So this is the rhythm of twos. It doesn't have to be, the way that Dickens does it is quite, very explicit and, very, very patterned. It doesn't have to be, used in that way. It can also be more subtle. I'll just read you this one from Colin McCann. Rather, it was the man shape that held them there, their necks craned, torn between the promise of doom and the disappointment of the ordinary. Right? You see the rhythm of twos in that last part of the sentence. It's communicating the same kind of thing, the sense of certainty, harmony, fairness, authority, right? Lightness and dark, night and day, in and out, bread and butter. It's this sort of, this dual nature of the world. And then we have the rhythm of threes, and this has been called the rule of three. And I think that is, again, there are no rules in fiction, but three is a good number if you're doing lists and stuff like that. So, you have this one from Daniel Webster. I was born in America, and I will live in America, and I shall die in America. And again, this is an example of epistrophe, but it's three. It's just that it happens in threes. And it's interesting that, the rhythm of threes is often used in lists. As with the rhythm of twos, there seems to be something natural about three, something rhythmically and spiritually satisfying. Three little pigs, three dimensions, three musketeers, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, whatever. Things just do happen in threes, and that's a good thing to recognize. That it's especially, but it's digestible. It's something that feels right. It feels complete. It feels natural and and satisfying, right? Rhythmically satisfying. So let's look at this next example. Someone read us this one from Sunil Yapa's Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist. This is just a list, but let's read this list the way that he has it written. Anyone? Yeah, Marianne.
Sure. 40 countries in 5 years. Armenia, Aruba, Austria, Belgium and Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland and France, Germany and Greece, Grenada and Guyana. Some were easier than others. Haiti, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, and Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Sweden, Switzerland.
Thank you. So you see how this is? It's just a long list of countries. And if he just did, this list with just commas in between them, it seemed to be like, what's he doing this for? But he's by breaking it into he's breaking it into twos and threes, and in some cases more, right? Mostly pairs and triads, but there are also quads and quints. But maybe that keeps it from being too pat. I mean, you wouldn't want to break it down into just all groups of threes, right? But it implies when you get into quads and quints, so the twos and the threes we've already talked about. It's just a sense of harmony, authority. Threes is a sense of sort of naturalness, completeness. But then when you get into quads and quints, you start having this feeling of things overflowing, bigness. In other words, there are many countries that are not being mentioned, and it's sort of more difficult, right? And so these number series kind of stick in our minds. If you want a reader to remember something, remember the power of number series, how the rhythm of 2s and 3s and 4s can communicate subconscious meanings that either emphasize or undercut what you're trying to do. For the last thing that we're going to read today, will someone read us this one from Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things? This is one of the greatest lists in literature, I think, or at least that I've read.
Mhm.
Anyone?
I can do it.
Great, thanks, Teresa.
The world, locked out for years, suddenly flooded in, and now Estha couldn't hear himself for the noise. Trains, traffic, music, the stock market. A dam had burst, and savage waters swept everything up in a swirling. Comets, violins, parades, loneliness, clouds, beards, bigots, lists, flags, earthquakes, despair were all swept up in a scramble swirling.
Great, thank you. So, again, you often hear about the rule of 3, and I think the rule of 3 is a good thing to consider. Oftentimes it is good to do 3 if you want sort of harmonious writing. It's not a rule, and it's not always the best choice for a number series. It's good to think about some of the underlying effects of number series. But in the Roy thing, do you see how it's a sense of sort of overflowing? And she's actually, this is a sentence that we're going to talk about a lot. It's a sentence that, this last one is a sentence that sings the meaning of itself, because it's everything, all of these things she lists. And when she's doing these short lists, and then she does the longer one, and it's sort of, everything is swept up into scrambled swirling, which is what she's saying, but that's also the effect of doing this sort of long list at the end. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So, so think of it this way. If 2 represents certainty and authority, and 3 represents logic, believability, clarity, completeness, then 4 or more represents something bigger, something human, emotional, diffuse, messy, inexplicable, a whole community or a society, maybe even a whole world. It's standing in, the longer list really stand in for something bigger. You're trying to imply something bigger by putting more items in that list. Does that make sense? And of course, in Arundhati Roy's case, it's the choice of what she puts into that list. It's like, wow, this incredible juxtaposition. But so the final writing exercise is to do later, and that is to find a list in your writing, or to make one up from the world of something that you're writing, and just to rearrange it or rearranging it using different number series, and sort of play around with the effects of these lists, and see what you notice. So I'm just going to summarize what we talked about today, and then I want to open it up for any final questions. We can linger after we don't have to end at 2:30, but so we talked about the 3 core qualities of great sentences: economy, specificity, musicality. And as we talked about them, we discovered that there are more to each of these qualities than first meets the eye. There are no hard and fast rules, but there are concrete ways to improve your sentence writing. In terms of economy, cutting is a virtue, but only up to the point where cutting starts to blur or dumb down a sentence's meaning. If that happens, you've cut too much, you've gone too far. In terms of specificity, we reminded ourselves that we should always be looking to move from the more general to the more specific, from the more abstract to the more concrete, from the more vague and blurry to the more vivid, because this is how we can really begin to bring our sentences alive. And in terms of musicality, which we've only really just begun to discuss, we consider the importance of pattern and variation, parallelism, strategic repetition, and serial constructions. Does that sound right? A good summary? So the question is, how might you employ all this stuff in your writing? And you could and should probably try to incorporate some of it into your first draft writing, but only to the extent that it doesn't slow you down. I think first draft writing kind of depends on you forgetting that you're writing, not necessarily just sort of letting your subconscious mind run with it. But it may be even more useful in revision. I think I mentioned at the beginning that, you know, I'm a novelist, and when I write, I often try to get the basic stuff down first, the structure, the plot, the story, you know, so I can feel confident in the architecture, and then use the later revisions really to work on language and working on it sentence by sentence, one sentence at a time, not rushing through it. And I find that working on it on this sort of sentence by sentence level makes it both easier and more effective. And so in the next session, we'll be looking at ways to incorporate suspense at the sentence level to make our prose even more irresistible to readers than it already is. And we'll look at some really cool strategies for building longer sentences using cumulative syntax that will add to our skill in making sentences that are clear, effective, and highly musical. So that's all I have, but I will hang around if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Hopefully this has been something that's been useful for you, even though it's kind of short. Any thoughts or questions?
I would say, go ahead.
Just because I'm in the middle of it right now, if anybody wants an example of a novel with just unbelievable specificity of detail, All the Light We Cannot See is just amazing. It just kind of conveys everything through specific detail rather than the narrator kind of making pronouncements, and it's really wonderful.
Great. Marianne?
Yeah, I was going to say that the sentence level is absolutely my favorite part about writing, partly because I started out as a writer writing poetry, and which, yeah, so that totally makes sense. But this is all these quotations, and hearing all of us read them aloud is just really a joy. Really lovely, and I love that we ended up with the Arundhati Roy, this scrambled swirling.
Yeah, that's another great novel, and both in terms of specificity and in terms of sort of the mobility of the voice, the way that point of view can go everywhere in that world. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, and for many of you, I'll see you next time. And you know, feel free to shoot me an email or whatever you have any questions. And happy writing and reading.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.